Good morning and welcome to Detroit Wants to Know. You know, I'm really confused here. Detroit gets lauded for electing Mayor Duggan. Greatest thing since sliced bread. However, it seems that Lansing wants to do everything they can to take away our other elected leadership, which is the Detroit School Board. So we get lauded for Duggan, laughed at and scorned for our other elected leaders, our Detroit Public School Board. The other issue that I have here, ladies and gentlemen, besides just the electoral issue that's going on, that's got me really confused is, what in the world would my God-fearing suburban friends think if their students were subjected to the type of experimentation that the Detroit students are subjected to? This is just crazy. It's just unconscionable. I have my good friend Thomas Pedroni, Dr. Thomas Pedroni of Wayne State University, to try and help me figure this out. Dr. Pedroni, welcome back to Detroit Wants to Know. Am I off base with the experimentation?
Not at all, Steve, and thanks so much for having me on today again. I love being on your show so much. I've gotten great feedback on your interviews. So I don't think that you're off base at all. I mean, what I like to do is I like to draw people's attention with the governor's new plan here now for Detroit that he's been rolling out. I'd like to draw the comparison with Flint, right? So in Flint, with the water, with the lead now in our children's brains and the brains of other families, community members there, we have an example where citizens were not able to exercise oversight, and we see what happened. We had a situation where emergency management came in, and in the name supposedly of good management and austerity, made decisions that will have costs that are astronomical, both in actual cost and the cost in human lives and the impact on our children. It's despicable. And the exact same logic that we see playing out in Flint is playing out now in Detroit, where we have had devastating results from state control the last 6 years of emergency management, but really we need to talk about the last 13 of 16 years because we had a previous state takeover as well. And the impact, like in Flint, has been absolutely devastating. Each step of the way, we have had local people raising their voice to say, stop. Just as you had it in Flint, you've had it here in Detroit with the egregious conditions in the EAA, with the various corruption scandals. But we have not had that kind of citizen oversight. There's nowhere for those voices to be heard because the good fathers from Lansing have taken over and are trying to get us to believe that they know what to do better. And with every category in schools, whether we're talking about the test scores and academic performance, whether we're talking about the financial circumstance, whether we're talking about enrollment, it's been an absolute disaster. And what does the state want to do? It wants to double down. It wants to continue.
But the state would say, the state is on the hook for the debt, so we should have control. Of course, the argument against that is, well, your controlling leadership caused the debt because before the state took over, there was a surplus.
Right.
So how does this continue?
Well,
what would happen? You don't live in Detroit. I noticed you had a 734 phone number. What would happen in whatever town? What town do you live in?
Well, my kids go to school in Ann Arbor.
They go to Ann Arbor.
Right.
So what would happen if they tried this mess in Ann Arbor?
Look, we all know pretty well that what happened to the kids in Flint with the lead wouldn't happen in Ann Arbor, right? We know the same thing with the schools as well. We know that people are not devalued. The electorate is not devalued there the way that it is in Detroit. What we see in Flint, what we see in Detroit is a chance with education for a lot of people who are friends of the governors and friends of other powerful people to get their hands on that public money that's intended for the public schools and to get it into private hands. And that's really what this is all about, is who gets to control the contracts, who gets to control the dollars. And the main thing that the board has been asking for, and I think they're absolutely right, is they said, we want an audit, we want a forensic audit. And that's why they will never get back control. Because if they get back control, the first thing they're going to do is an audit, and the corruption that we've heard about so far, the misspending, the damage to our kids, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg.
We've got to go to break, but when we come back, I want to talk about the educational industrial complex, which you mentioned the last time you were here, because it seems to be growing. It seems to start a whole new $200 million just to fund the startup of the empowerment zones. I guess that's what it is.
Right. Right.
We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back with Dr. Thomas Pedroni of Wayne State, telling it like it is. Experiment Would they do what they're doing to Detroit and Ann Arbor? I think not. We'll be right back.
How would you like for this to be you? This is your chance. WVIE 107.3 FM and WHPR 88.1 FM are looking for people with outgoing personalities who can attract sponsors. If you're into talk, R&B, oldies, jazz, gospel, or soca, have your own radio show. We have block time available. Call 313-868-6612. Radio we can see, broadcasting live in the Virgin Islands and Detroit.
Mike's Fresh Market, Detroit's largest independent supermarket with the best prices, quality, and service. Enjoy our vast selection of fresh fruits and vegetables. Wide aisles lead you to our own in-house bakery and deli. Beef, pork, chicken, seafood, and much more. You can rest assured you will feed your family the freshest food in town. Whatever you need, you can find it here at Mike's Fresh Market. Mike's Fresh Market with 2 locations, Gratiot and 7 Mile and Livernois and 7 Mile. Better food, better prices. That's Mike's promise.
With 20 top surgeons performing over a dozen of the latest knee, hip, and joint procedures at the hospitals you know and trust, we only have one question. Where does it hurt? Orthopedics and Sports Medicine at the DMC. Call 888-DMC-2500. The DMC's sports medicine specialists, the official docs of our Detroit Red Wings. With offices throughout Southeast Michigan and more than 30 rehabilitation locations, we can make you feel better in all these places. Call 888-DMC-2500.
Welcome back to Detroit Wants to Know. My guest this week is Dr. Thomas Pedroni from Wayne State University. Dr. Pedroni, when we left, we talked about the educational industrial complex, which you mentioned on the last show that we did out in the suburbs. It seems that that's happening again. The governor in his package of bills is saying, I need $200 million for startup of this new umbrella operation, the empowerment zone operation. I guess that's what it is. All right. Talk about that.
Let's talk about that. I mean, for one thing, let's talk about the incredible inefficiency which that $200 million is going to. You have to point out the irony of someone who is a Republican governor who is now saying that we need to add in new layers of bureaucracy, new layers of red tape, right? We already have an elected board. But we're going to put on top of that, we're going to have a new board that is first going to be appointed over this new entity, the Detroit Community Schools or whatever they're calling it. And then there's going to be above that another layer of bureaucracy called the Detroit Educational Commission that is responsible for various things, including opening and closing schools. We have all of that structure already in DPS.
Let me get this straight. Mayor Duggan's Detroit Education Commission sits here, and then the empowerment zone, the Educational Empowerment Zone sits here, or is it this way?
I think that there are 3 layers of bureaucracy that we're talking about beyond the already elected and very dutifully acting without pay for the last 4 years elected board. There is the new appointed board that under the governor's plan would come over the new Detroit Public Schools entity. Above that is the Detroit Education Commission, which would be above the EAA and the charters and the NDPS, or whatever they call it.
That's Mayor Duggan's entity.
Well, under the governor's plan, it's 4 from the governor's office and 3 from the mayor. I think the mayor, if I understand it correctly, wants to have all 7, and that's still being worked out. But then above that, you also have financial review. The Financial Review Board at the state level. So we're talking about 3 levels of bureaucracy above the bureaucracy we already have. So you can imagine that's where something like the $200 million comes from, right? But we do know, I am happy to know that the governor is trying to make the case that the debt for Detroit should be covered by the state. Absolutely, it's the state's responsibility, just as it is with the issue of Charles Pugh and his access to our children through Detroit public schools. That's the state's responsibility. So I'm glad that that responsibility is being taken. But you've got to take the responsibility in a way that, first of all, you're not getting the rest of the districts all across the state mad at Detroit because it's coming out of their per pupil at the rate of $50 per student, which is what he wants to do. It's not their fault. It's state government's fault. It should come from somewhere else, like from the Treasury office, for example.
I got to rewind just for one second. You referenced Charles Pugh. You're talking about the settlement that the Detroit Public Schools agreed to?
The $250,000.
350,000.
I think they settled on 250,000. But in case we're talking about
we're talking about that. You're talking about that settlement
more than I've seen in a while.
Now, recently, the Board of Education has said, the elected board has said, this is the state's problem.
Yes.
Okay, and so you think the governor should go ahead and say, yes, this is the state's problem. It's the state's problem. Why?
Because under emergency management. I mean, it goes back, it's just like the Flint story. It's just like the idea of citizen oversight. During the time of emergency management, you have 3 elected board members who, because they listened to the community, were aware of that particular problem with Charles Pugh. And they have now signed affidavits that say that they informed emergency management of this problem and emergency management did nothing. So what you can see there is you had the mechanisms of citizen oversight that we're supposed to have through an elected board, which would have put a stop to it. And they could not put a stop to it because of emergency management, because of the state's imposition.
Okay, we've got about a minute left before we have to go. The EAA, embroiled in controversy about a former official, and now we hear that the chancellor of EAA has hired some of her friends to do educational support services.
It does seem like almost every day we have a new scandal coming out of the EAA, right? We've had more than a dozen officials, high-level officials, who have received grand jury subpoenas. We have the principal who pled guilty. We have new scandals about this $1.7 million contract with ties back to the chancellor's friends. We don't know what's there, but we do know that a lot of questions are being asked, and it doesn't sound very good. And this is exactly what it's about, is when you take away democracy and you take away the accountability that democracy provides, then what you get is you get the intrusion of anyone who can get inside of that door. And that's what we've seen. We're paying the price for that, whether it's lead or Charles Pugh or the contracts and the corruption, whatever.
Did you just say lead or Charles Pugh? Just want to know. Tom, we got to go to break. We got to head over to the Turkey Grill.
Okay.
One more thing. Yes or no question. Would this type of behavior towards Detroit elected officials and Detroit individuals, the people, the voters of Detroit, would that be tolerated in the Ann Arbor School District?
Absolutely not. It's an issue of race and racism. And a lot of the work of the state gets done because of racism and the way that whites are willing to believe about the people of Detroit and who they elect, which is simply not true.
Tom, thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, when we come back, we're going to the Turkey Grill. We're going to talk about domestic violence, as if you haven't heard enough domestic violence this morning. We'll be right back from the Turkey Grill.